What I want to do today is talk about accountability. And I don't just want to talk about it. I want to geek out on accountability because it is the word that is the most commonly used and rarely well applied in the entire field of leadership and culture and management and how do you create a human place to work. We have so many negative associations, weird associations, strange misconceptions about what accountability is, how does it work, what are the obstacles to creating it? And I wanted to spend some time today unpacking that and really diving into some of the details so that you can get accountability right on your team. I want to start with a story from way back, probably 15 years ago. I was working with a small business owner. He had a really successful marketing agency, and we were doing some one-to-one coaching. I was doing executive coaching at the time. And he was complaining about his general manager and some of the behaviors and some of the ways that the GM wasn't showing up in the way that he would have wanted. And, we were just having this coaching conversation. There was actually a couple other people on the call. And I gave some offhand advice, turned out to be bad advice, but we learned from it, where I said, why don't you just talk with him about what you're seeing? Sounded obvious to me at the time, maybe sounds obvious to you. And he said, oh, that's a good idea. I should go talk to him. Makes sense. And it was a conversation around accountability and behavior and those kinds of things. So I didn't think much of it. This leader, he went off, came back a couple weeks later, and I asked him, I said, how did it go with your GM? How was that conversation? And he just went like gray. And he said, well, it really didn't go well. And I said, tell me what happened. And he said, well, I read him the riot act, just like you said. And I said, whoa. I didn't say read him the riot act. I said, have a conversation with him. That's what I thought you were going to do. And what quickly emerged in that moment is that he had spent so much time letting himself get frustrated about the behavior. He had spent so much time kind of managing around and kind of playing chess with his GM, trying to get this person to do what he wanted to do. Then when we actually gave him permission, well, I guess I gave him permission to go and have the conversation, he really blasted the guy. And not surprisingly, the conversation, didn't go well. This is a phenomenon that I've seen hundreds and hundreds of times over the years, where there's this pressure built up, where accountability isn't happening or hasn't been happening. Leaders don't know what to do. We kind of fumble around it. We manage around it. We have all these weird conversations. We spend a lot of time venting, talking to our spouses or friends, complaining, it's a mess. Then when we actually go and have a conversation or try to have a conversation with someone, it doesn't go well. And it's something I used to call a spontaneous manager combustion, right? Which is, we let the pressure build and build and build and build. And then it just, we just explode. And it doesn't take much to feel like your manager has just exploded or really sort of come after you, given the nature of power dynamics. Some comment that you might feel as a manager or as an executive, you might feel, it was just an offhand comment, but they took it real hard. And it should only take a minute to reflect back and remember other times where you've been on the receiving end to think, oh yeah, that's right. When it comes from your boss, it comes with a lot of weight, comes with a lot of extra weight. So it was in that moment where I had the genesis of this idea to create the accountability dial, which I want to talk to you about today. And the reason was very simple. What I found was in talking with executives, business owners, and leaders, and just looking at myself and my own behavior as a CEO myself at that time, was we needed an interrupt. We needed something that we could put in between us and the behavior that we were seeing that would change the nature of that conversation. So rather than spontaneous manager combustion, waiting, letting the pressure build and sort of lashing out, what could we introduce as a disruptor of that pattern or of that tendency to try to create productive conversations, more productive conversations, to minimize the likelihood of defensiveness, to minimize the likelihood that I'm going to bring too much emotion into the conversation, to minimize the likelihood of someone playing victim or blaming the system or making excuses, and to maximize the possibility, the potential for them to take personal ownership of whatever has happened, right? To not shoot the messenger, the manager or the executive or the first-time manager who probably delivered the feedback imperfectly, right? How do we separate that from the actual message? So that was what the genesis of the accountability dial was all about. And so we were just kind of talking out loud on that call. We said, well, it's not a rigid, kind of step-by-step, paint by numbers thing. It's more like a volume knob. It's more like a dial, right? And the goal of the dial is to turn up the conversation, not the level of authority, but the level of clarity, the level of curiosity, the level of challenge in a human way. How do we turn it up step by step, just enough to help the person that we are trying to talk with take personal ownership of that change? And this is the really critical thing about the accountability dial. The accountability dial is nothing more and nothing less than a framework for positive change. That's it. And many of us, I would say most of us, have a whole other set of associations to the word accountability, and they're mostly negative. Some people, not many, but some people have positive associations to accountability, had really good mentors, parents who really knew how to use their authority well. But most of us, not so much. We had parents that were either too tough or too accommodating. And both of those are equally problematic ways to inhabit authority. If we're too tough, not enough empathy, not enough support, not enough love, that's no good. But if we're too accommodating, too much support, right? Too much compassion, too much of a willingness to kind of look the other way, not helpful either. No boundaries, no consequences. There's no crispness to the way we use authority. So most of us have had experiences, some people have had experiences with both, but most of us had really formative experiences with parents, mentors, teachers, coaches, maybe religious figures in your life early on who did one of the two. They were either too tough, right, too rigid, or too soft. And a good authority is someone who knows how to balance that, to be the right combination of tough and empathic, or what I would say kind, to tell you the truth, but to do it in a way that's supportive. So that's what the accountability dial is for. It's a mechanism, because it's difficult to do, because we all have so much history, so much baggage, a lot of trauma. It's really difficult. We get in the heat of the moment with someone, we don't know what to do. So the accountability dial is a tool, right, to hold on to say, okay, where am I in this conversation? Am I in the authority position, or am I in the less authority position? I'm in the subordinate position. How do I want to orient myself to this conversation? What questions can I ask? What stage are we in? How much, if I'm the person who's in authority, how much of that authority do I need to bring? As little as possible, right? How much empathy is called for in this moment? How much curiosity is called for in this moment? How much toughness is called for in this moment? How much of this is something that I contributed to, where part of the reason why they're struggling is because of something that I did or didn't do, or some conditions that I created or failed to create? How much of it is on them, where they have all the information, resources, feedback, and coaching, and they either can't or won't make the change? These are really complicated analyses to make. Now, try to do that in the heat of the moment, in the busy workday where there's a million things going on and everybody's logged into 275 different apps, and there's pressure and the marketplace is changing, and you look at the outside world, you can understand why getting this right is so difficult and so rare. So we're going to get into the accountability dial in a moment. I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps. But the critical thing to remember in the accountability dial is a framework for positive change. That's it. It has nothing to do with punitivity. It's not a warning system. It's not 3 strikes and you're out. It's not a gotcha system. It's not performance management. It is none of those things. It's a framework for how to have a conversation with another human that you care about, right? It's a framework to have a conversation with another human that you care about or that is in your care. You're in a position of authority relative to this person. It's your job to care about them. It's a framework for how do you set up cycles of positive change with this person in a way that honors the role of authority that you are in and their sovereignty as a human being, that it's their journey, not yours. Your job is to provide feedback. Your job is to provide the context. Your job is to create the conditions, but it's their job to take on the personal journey. How do you do that in a context that is supportive, that's based in good coaching principles, that's based in empathy, but it's also based in boundaries and consequences and being tough when is needed and challenging people so that they can become their better self. And all you have to do is think about all the other domains of life, your financial goals, your relationship goals, your health goals. No matter the domain of life, if there are no consequences to not changing, we don't change. There either has to be something, some pain that I want to avoid, or some pleasure, comfort, satisfaction that I want to get. That's it. We're pretty simple beings in that way. I want to avoid pain, right? I want to avoid negative consequences of things that I don't want in my life. And I want to attract positive things, good consequences, joy, connection, belonging, growth, potential, impact, right? So your feedback and your coaching and your use of the dial, hopefully it's helping me do those two things, one of those two things in any one moment. You're either helping me avoid the negative consequences of a track that I'm on, or you're helping me accelerate the path towards something that I do want to get. That's what accountability is for. It's a framework for positive change to help somebody else in a moment for whatever reason, just like us, they're struggling to really get it for themselves, to take ownership of that change for themselves, to get out of victimhood around a situation. Easiest thing to do. There's a million reasons to blame the outside world, someone else, some system, some process, some person down the hall who did something wrong, for sure. We could spend our whole lives blaming those people and not taking ownership for our own part in a dynamic. But that's not what accountability is. That's not the framework for positive change. So that's the backdrop. That's the context. And I have had this conversation with leaders over and over and over again over the years. It's fine. It's good. It's a really difficult thing to get right because the barriers to getting it right are emotional, not in the person you're trying to hold accountable. The barriers to creating a culture of accountability are in you. They're in me as the leader. They're my obstacles. They're your obstacles to showing up in a world in a way that balances empathy, hard to do on its own, and boundaries, hard to do on its own. And you got to do both. And what you'll find is when you even get that a little bit, forget about mastery, we'll get there. But even if you get there a little bit, you will see people light up. You will see people go to places that they have never gone before. Why? Because 99 out of 100 people have never worked for somebody who knows how to do what you're about to learn how to do. The accountability dial is a 5-stage framework for how to start, guide, and complete difficult conversations. It is also a way to start, manage, and complete positive conversations, praise conversations. You can use it for feedback with a direct report. You can use it for feedback with a peer or a conversation with a peer, someone at the same level as you. And you can use it to manage up. It is the same framework in all three of those situations, whether you're the person with more power in that moment, whether you have the same amount of power as the person you're talking with, or whether you have less. In all three of those situations, the first step is the same, what we call the mention. The mention is a simple observation or a question about something you're seeing. You could think of it as that, it's like that, hey, do you have a second? There's something I wanted to ask you about. Or in our meeting this morning, I noticed this, that, or the other thing. Or I was wondering, I've been following along on this email thread, and I was wondering about this thing. Did you notice that? It's all about curiosity. The mention, the first step in the accountability dial is all about curiosity. It's all about you getting out of your head, right? And seeing something out there in the world on a team, with a person, in a document, in an email, anywhere, in the organization, on the team, and saying, hey, that piques my interest. There's something about that doesn't seem right. There's something about that seems like it conflicts with this other thing that I know is our priority. You don't have to be right. You don't have to have all the data. You don't have to have the answer. You don't have to have the solution. This is why it's so hard to do, because we're so trained to not talk about anything unless we can be solution-oriented. Forget about it. Curiosity is the opposite of solution-oriented in the traditional sense. Being curious, the mention is all about opening up a conversation that we don't have the answer to. That's the whole point of curiosity, right? So you got to put away the solution-oriented part of your brain for a moment And you have to think about just asking a question, just making an observation. Hey, I noticed this. Can you tell me, did you notice it? Your goal is just to get into what we would call a shared reality, which is not the same thing as agreeing. You don't have to agree. That's not what's important. What's important is that you and I are talking about the same thing. We're talking about the same meeting, the same proposal, the same conflict, the same misalignment on the team. Are we talking about the same thing? And you'll be surprised to find out that most of the time, better than 80% of the time in the workplace, two people think they're talking about the same thing and they're not. So that's the mention. That's the first step in the accountability dial. That alone, forget about the next 4 steps. The first step alone is transformative to a team and to a culture, that curiosity, because we're so solution oriented. We're all so much in our inboxes. We're so task and transactional in the way that we're operating day in and day out. When you as the manager inject just a little bit of curiosity, it goes such a long way. The second step in the accountability dial is the invitation. When you look at most teams, most cultures, most families, most relationships, what you'll find, it's not that there's no feedback ever being given. There's feedback being given all the time. But that feedback is never followed up on. Or when it is followed up on, it's just repeating the same thing. Well, I already asked you that. I'm going to ask you that again. I'm going to ask you that again. That's not the accountability dial. The accountability dial is changing the nature of the feedback to fit the situation. So the mention, let's say you've made a mention, hey, I noticed this, and you didn't get a great response. Or you got okay, yeah, I'll take a look at it, but you don't see anything change. You go to the next stage, which is the invitation. The invitation is you re-raising the conversation and pointing out the existence of, or the seeming existence of, a pattern. Hey, remember I made that comment in the hallway the other day? I've actually seen a couple of other things. I think they're connected. What do you think? Does this seem like part of something that's maybe a larger theme that we should talk about? Is this something I'm doing? Is this something you're doing? Is this something that's happening on the team? Same curiosity, same lack of punitivity. It has nothing to do with punishment. I'm not trying to catch that person in a trap. I'm just trying to raise their awareness to something that I think is problematic or worth changing, or something great that's worth reinforcing. So we've went from the mention to the invitation. It's the naming of the seeming of a pattern. You don't know. You might have a little bit of information. You may have a theory about why something is happening, but you're bringing curiosity because you don't know, and you don't need to know. You're asking the question. That's the second stage in the accountability dial, what we call the invitation. If somebody mentions something to you, they give you some feedback, you might even acknowledge it. Someone else says, oh, I think there's a little bit of a pattern emerging. You might even acknowledge, you might even agree. But nevertheless, you haven't been able to make that change. Why? Well, because you haven't really felt the impact of not changing, either on yourself or some other person. And that's what the third stage of the accountability dial is, the conversation. It's helping that person shift a very specific thing. We're trying to shift the person that we're trying to help from thinking about what's going on from the level of intention. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Most people don't mean to cause harm to other people, to shift their attention from intention to impact. Hey, I get that that's not the intention that you're trying to create, but let's talk about the impact that you're having, or that you may be having. And you can ask them some questions, and you can spur their self-reflection. Again, in a spirit of curiosity, in a spirit of understanding, in a spirit of coaching and development and support, and especially acknowledging your authority if you have authority in that relationship. You're trying to shift their attention from intention to impact. That is a huge shift for people. Oh, because a lot of people will try to let themselves off the hook. You know, it's reasonable, it's normal. Oh, I didn't mean that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really do anything to change the culture. It doesn't really do anything to change the nature of the relationship. But if you acknowledge your impact, if you come to me and say, hey, I did that thing. I wasn't trying to create more work for you, but I realized that it did in these ways. And I'm really sorry about that. And I'm making some changes to make sure that impact doesn't come your way again. Okay, now you got me. Now I'm hooked. Now I want to know more. Now we're getting closer. Now we're building our relationship. So we've been through the third stage of the conversation. We talked about the mention, the invitation, the conversation. And it never follows an exact linear process. We're human beings, we're complicated, right? So you might go mention, invitation, back to invitation, conversation. We'll see. Depends on the situation, depends on the gravity of the situation, depends if it's for your direct, depends if it's for your peers, depends if it's for someone more senior, depends if it's for praise, depends how, it depends, right? where you are in the dial in any given situation. So let's get into the last two steps before we close up. The fourth stage in the accountability dial, the fourth step, was what we call the boundary. And I've had this conversation probably 500 times in the last 10 years where I would ask an executive or a CEO, tell me about accountability. Oh, accountability is a core value in our organization. We're big believers in accountability. And I said, great, tell me about a situation where there was a consequence for somebody not being accountable in their role. Crickets. If there are no consequences to a lack of accountability, then there's no accountability. Then it's just an empty word. You might as well not use it. So this shift of understanding that consequences are not punitive, consequences are helpful. As long as they come in a spirit of coaching and development, we need consequences. We need to know what's going to happen to us if we don't change our behavior, just like in the rest of our world, financially, relationships, health-wise. What's going to happen to me if I don't quit smoking? What's going to happen to me if I don't stop eating fried foods and I never exercise? Well, I need to know that because that helps me motivate to change. And on the flip side, what's going to happen that's good if I do those things? Oh, you're going to live longer. You're going to be healthier. You're going to be around to play with your kids. Whatever I want to know what the positive outcomes are. What are the negative outcomes? Be clear with me. That's what the boundary is. What needs to change? By when? What does change look like? And again, not punitive, in the spirit of growth and development and learning. And that paradoxically, even though that's the thing that we tend to avoid as managers and leaders, because I understand, I know they're working so hard, I know they have so many things on their plate, we start making a whole bunch of excuses and we don't realize, it's tough to accept, we don't realize we're actually undermining their sovereignty. We're treating them like children instead of treating them like adults who are capable of prioritizing. They are capable of making difficult choices, but if we don't hold them accountable, if we don't create consequences and boundaries, they won't. Much more difficult to do. The last step in the accountability dial before we wrap up here today is what we call the limit. And people get confused. The limit doesn't mean you're fired, right? The limit means I, as the person trying to help you, I feel like I've given you all the feedback. I've given you all the coaching that I could think of, imperfect as it may have been. I've surfaced all the data that I think is relevant. I've given you my time, my resource, my support, coaching, my support, maybe support from other people. And I've done everything that I think is reasonable in order to help you make this change. And now I have to pull back. I have a lot of other things to do. I have other priorities. I have other commitments. I can't keep coaching you on this topic forever. I need you to step up and make this change in some way. I need you to take ownership of it. I need you to do that next round of reflection, especially if it's a difficult change to make. And it's that moment where a good coach, a good consultant, a good manager, a good leader, that's when you earn your stripes. As a leader who believes in accountability, it's not just starting the feedback conversation, it's knowing when to end it. Not to end the person, not to fire them, but to trust, to care so much about their sovereignty as a human being that you say, okay, I've done everything that I can do and the ball is in your court. Can't wait to see what you do with this. I get it's a difficult moment. I get it's a difficult change. I'll be here to support you on the other side, but now it's on you. Those are the 5 stages of the accountability dial. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's a really challenging world to create accountability in because we don't have a lot of great examples for how accountability works. But that's what I hope you take from this and the accountability dial and this process for having these conversations. I look forward to sharing more with you in the future.